Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights and drift back to a time often painted with broad strokes of glory and romance, the age of knighthood and chivalry. Close your eyes and imagine the grand castles, the gleaming armor, the noble knights riding forth to save damsels and slay dragons. You might picture tournaments with colorful banners fluttering and valiant champions bowing to adoring crowds. It feels like a fairy tale, doesn't it? A bygone era of honor, courage, and true heroism. But here's a little historical reality check. If you were actually living back then, you'd probably be far more concerned with surviving the mud, the disease, and the utter brutality that was a much more common companion to knighthood than shining armor and fair maidens. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these sleepy stories travel. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. We often imagine knights as stoic figures, living by an unshakable code, always ready to protect the weak and uphold justice. The very word chivalry conjures images of gentlemen opening doors, of respect and courtesy. But the harsh origins of chivalry are far more rooted in the brutal realities of medieval warfare and the desperate need to control a volatile warrior class. Think less about courtly love poems and more about muddy, blood-soaked battlefields. The chivalric code, in its earliest forms, was less about being nice and more about establishing a set of rules for powerful armed men who could wreak havoc on society if left unchecked. It was a pragmatic attempt to civilize, even slightly, a class of professional killers. Imagine yourself a peasant in a small village in, say, rural France around the 11th or 12th century. The local lord, a knight, might seem like your protector against bandits or rival lords, but he was also just as likely to be the source of your troubles. Knights were essentially armed landlords, and their primary function was to fight, to protect their lands, and crucially, to expand them. This often involved raiding, pillaging, and terrorizing the very people they were supposedly meant to protect. The ideal of the noble knight was often a distant dream for those living under their direct, often heavy-handed, rule. The training to become a knight was anything but glamorous. It began in childhood. As a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, you would be sent away from your home to live in the household of another lord or knight, becoming a page. Here, you would learn basic manners, some reading and writing if you were lucky, and fundamental military skills like riding and swordsmanship. You'd serve at table, run errands, and generally perform various duties, a kind of noble servant. Imagine leaving your family at such a tender age, entering a world of strict hierarchy and rigorous discipline, far from the comforts of home. As you grew older, usually around 14, you would advance to become a squire. This was where the real brutal training began. You would be a personal assistant and bodyguard to a knight, following him into battle, carrying his armor, tending to his horses, and learning the brutal realities of warfare firsthand. You'd clean his weapons, help him don his heavy armor, and even stand by him during combat, handing him fresh weapons or helping him back up if he fell. Imagine the sheer physical endurance required, lugging heavy equipment, riding long distances, and witnessing gruesome violence up close. Day after day, the life of a squire was not one of leisure. You would practice constantly with heavy swords, lances, and shields, often engaging in mock combat that was almost as dangerous as the real thing. Jousting practice involved charging at a wooden quintain, a rotating target that would swing around and knock you off your horse if you missed or hit it incorrectly. Imagine the bruises, the broken bones, the constant pain, all in the name of preparing for a life that was almost guaranteed to involve more pain. This grueling regimen, far from being a sport, was a matter of life and death, shaping young men into hardened warriors. The code of chivalry, which we romanticize so much, was a complex and often contradictory set of ideals. It evolved over centuries and was rarely uniformly applied, While it spoke of courage, honor, justice, and protection of the weak, it was primarily a code for knights dealing with other knights or specific classes of people. It often did not extend to peasants, merchants, or, famously, to the infidel during crusades. Imagine a knight who would chivalrously treat a captured noble opponent, yet savagely burn a peasant village the very next day. This disconnect between ideal and reality is a common point of contention among medieval historians. Some argue that chivalry was a genuine, albeit evolving, attempt at moral guidance, while others see it as little more than a thin veneer over a fundamentally violent aristocratic culture. The act of knighting itself, while appearing ceremonial, was the culmination of years of brutal preparation. You would kneel before your lord, swear an oath of fealty, and be touched on the shoulder with a sword. This wasn't just a fancy ceremony, it was a binding contract, a lifelong commitment to service, loyalty, and warfare. It meant you were now a fully fledged member of the warrior elite, with all the responsibilities and dangers that entailed. Imagine the mix of pride and trepidation as you accepted this honor, knowing it bound you to a life of violence and uncertainty. Let's talk about medieval warfare itself. Forget the clean, cinematic battles. This was a messy, brutal, and often terrifying affair. Battles were fought hand-to-hand, in close quarters, often for hours. The ground would quickly turn to churned mud and blood. The sounds would be deafening: the clang of steel, the shouts of men, the screams of the wounded, the neighing of horses. Imagine the sheer chaos, the adrenaline, the fear, as you fought for your life amidst a swirling mass of armed men, each trying to kill you. There were no rules of engagement in the modern sense. It was a desperate fight to the death. The weapons were devastating. Swords could hack off limbs. Lances could impale. Maces could crush armor and bone. Arrows could pierce through flesh. Wounds were horrific, and without modern medicine. Even a relatively minor injury could become infected and prove fatal. Imagine being hit by a heavy blow, feeling the bone splinter, or seeing a gaping wound on your comrade. There was no real medical care on the battlefield, beyond perhaps a quick, desperate attempt to staunch blood flow. Survival was often a matter of luck as much as skill. The armor, which we often see as a symbol of invincibility, was incredibly heavy and restrictive. Early chainmail offered some protection but was vulnerable to crushing blows. Later plate armor, while more protective against cuts and thrusts, could weigh upwards of 50-70 pounds, distributed over the entire body. Imagine trying to fight, to maneuver, to even simply stand for hours in such a cumbersome suit, especially in the heat of summer or the mud of a battlefield. It was exhausting, dehydrating, and could make you a target if you fell and couldn't get up. A common misconception is that knights couldn't get up if they fell. While difficult, it was usually possible unless injured or bogged down in mud. Still, it was hardly graceful. You know, some medieval knights probably had an easier time fighting a dragon than they did just getting dressed in the morning. All those buckles and straps. Talk about a fashion nightmare. As you finally drift into the peaceful embrace of sleep, let the harsh sounds of battle and the heavy feel of imaginary armor fade. You've now seen past the shining veneer of knighthood, glimpsing the brutal reality of its origins, the rigorous training, and the savage nature of medieval combat. The romantic image of the knight is intertwined with a darker truth, a life of constant violence, hardship, and a code of conduct that was often more aspirational than actual. May the comfort of your own bed feel like the greatest luxury tonight, as the echoes of the knight's brutal training and the clang of early medieval battlefields begin to soften in your mind. A new, equally unsettling scene comes into focus. The sounds are not just those of direct combat, but a more pervasive, agonizing symphony of suffering. The distant screams of villagers, the crackle of burning timber, and the groan of collapsing stone. You are now entering the grim reality of medieval warfare beyond the open field. The brutal truth of raids, sieges, and the widespread suffering inflicted upon the innocent. Imagine yourself a non-combatant, A farmer or a merchant, living near a castle or a major trade route in medieval Europe. Your greatest fear isn't just a pitched battle between armies. It's the more common, insidious violence of a raid. Knights, far from their romanticized image, often engaged in brutal raiding campaigns against their enemies' lands. These weren't about grand strategic objectives. They were about plunder, terror, and destroying the enemy's resources. Imagine seeing a plume of smoke on the horizon, knowing that it means an armed band, perhaps even your own lordsmen, is approaching. When these raiding parties arrived, they brought utter devastation. Villages would be systematically plundered for food, livestock, and any valuables. Homes would be torched, fields burned, and wells poisoned. Imagine the terror of hiding with your family in the woods, watching your livelihood go up in flames. The smell of burning thatch thick in the air. This wanton destruction was a deliberate tactic to deprive the enemy of resources and to spread fear, often without any regard for the lives of the peasantry. This systematic destruction, often referred to as chevauchée in French, was a common medieval military tactic, but even more terrifying than raids were sieges. When an army couldn't defeat a fortified castle or city in open battle, they would surround it, cutting off its supplies and attempting to starve its inhabitants into submission. Sieges could last for months or even years, turning the lives of everyone inside into a slow, agonizing descent into hell. Imagine living within stone walls, the constant threat of enemy bombardment, the incessant sounds of catapults launching massive stones, or siege towers slowly moving towards your defenses. The greatest enemy during a siege was often starvation and disease. As food supplies dwindled, rations would become meager, then non-existent. People would resort to eating anything rats, leather, even each other in the most desperate circumstances. Water supplies could be cut off or poisoned, leading to rampant dehydration and illness. Overcrowding within the walls, combined with poor sanitation, created perfect breeding grounds for epidemics like dysentery and typhus, which often killed more people than the actual fighting. Imagine the hollow ache of hunger, the weakness, and the terror of watching your family waste away from illness, knowing there was nothing you could do. The psychological toll was immense. The constant threat of attack, the desperate hope for relief that often never came, and the slow, agonizing realization that death was inevitable, whether by hunger, disease, or the enemy's sword. Imagine the despair of seeing your loved ones sicken and die, of being unable to bury them properly, and of the profound helplessness as your world slowly crumbled around you. This prolonged suffering, this deliberate targeting of non-combatants, was a brutal reality of medieval warfare that is often ignored in romanticized accounts. And then there was the assault itself. If starvation didn't work, the attackers would launch a full-scale assault. Soldiers would storm the walls using ladders, siege towers, or by breaching fortifications with battering rams. This was incredibly bloody work, often resulting in massive casualties on both sides. Imagine the desperate hand-to-hand fighting on the ramparts, the screams, the clash of steel, the terrifying prospect of falling from a great height or being overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of the enemy. When a city or castle fell after a prolonged siege, the consequences were often horrific. The attacking army, enraged by the long wait and the casualties they had suffered, would often unleash their fury on the inhabitants. This meant massacres, widespread rape, and indiscriminate pillage. There was often little mercy shown, especially if the defenders had resisted fiercely. Imagine being a survivor, witnessing unspeakable horrors, seeing your friends and family slaughtered, and knowing that your life, if spared, would be irrevocably shattered. This rite of conquest was a brutal aspect of medieval warfare, designed to instill terror and discourage future resistance. You know, some historians argue that the promise of plunder and rape after a successful siege was often the only way medieval commanders could keep their troops motivated during the long, boring parts. Not exactly chivalrous, is it? The treatment of prisoners taken during a siege or battle was also far from chivalrous for common soldiers. While noble knights might be ransomed for a high price, ordinary foot soldiers or peasants captured during a raid were often summarily executed, enslaved, or simply left to die. There were no Geneva Conventions in the Middle Ages. Imagine being a simple soldier, knowing that capture meant almost certain death or a life of brutal servitude, with no hope of reprieve or fair treatment. This stark class distinction in the treatment of captives highlights the limits of any code of honor beyond the grand sieges. Petty warfare was a constant feature of medieval life, especially in regions with fragmented political power. Local lords might constantly skirmish with their neighbors over land, resources, or perceived insults. These weren't massive campaigns, but constant low-level conflicts that ravaged the countryside and made life precarious for everyone. Imagine living in a state of perpetual anxiety, never knowing when your village might be caught between two warring factions, or when a knight might decide to take what he wanted from you. The impact on trade and agriculture was devastating. Constant raiding and warfare disrupted trade routes, making it dangerous to transport goods and stifling economic growth. Farmers, fearing their crops would be burned, might plant less, leading to localized famines. The economy of entire regions could be shattered by prolonged conflict, leading to widespread poverty and suffering. Imagine trying to conduct business, or simply feed your family, when the very fabric of society was constantly being torn apart by violence. Even the landscape bore the scars of this brutality. Ruined castles, burned-out villages, abandoned fields. These were common sights across medieval Europe, silent testaments to centuries of conflict. The environment itself reflected the brutal reality of a time when war was endemic, and peace was often just a temporary pause between periods of violence. This ever-present threat shaped not just human lives, but the very appearance of the land. Finally, consider the psychological burden on those who lived through these brutal times. The constant fear of violence, the loss of loved ones, the destruction of homes and livelihoods would have left deep, lasting trauma. There was no concept of therapy or psychological support. People simply endured, carrying their grief and their fear with them, passing stories of suffering down through generations. The medieval world was one where violence was an intimate, ever-present part of life, shaping the very fabric of human experience. This pervasive, often unacknowledged trauma is a significant part of the brutal truth of the era. As the sounds of distant sieges and the cries from ravaged villages fade, and the comforting quiet of your room embraces you, let the raw realities of medieval warfare settle softly. You've seen beyond the romanticized battles, glimpsing the widespread destruction, the slow agony of starvation, and the terrifying lack of mercy that defined so much of the era's conflict. The truth about knighthood and chivalry is that their age was often one of profound human suffering, a stark reminder that even in times of supposed honor, brutality often held sway. May the peace of your knight bring you a deep sense of security, far from the echoes of that turbulent past. As the grim echoes of medieval raids and sieges begin to fade, a new, unsettling sensation presses in. The air around you grows heavy, not just with dampness, but with the cloying scent of stale sweat, unwashed bodies, and pervasive illness. You're no longer just observing the brutality of the era. You're now experiencing the constant, nagging discomforts and silent threats that define the daily lives of even the most powerful figures, the knights themselves. This chapter unveils the brutal truth of a knight's existence, far removed from the glorious battlefields. Imagine yourself as a knight, home from campaign, perhaps in a drafty castle hall in, say, Saxony or the Scottish borders. You might have a feast laid out, but the reality of medieval diet and hygiene was far from glamorous. Food, even for the nobility, was often monotonous and surprisingly unhealthy by modern standards. Meat was plentiful when available, but fresh vegetables and fruits were seasonal and often scarce, especially in winter. Imagine a diet heavy on salted or smoked meats. hard bread, and ale or weak wine water was often unsafe to drink. Nutritional deficiencies like scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, were common, leading to bleeding gums, loose teeth, and extreme fatigue. This wasn't a world of balanced meals and dietary supplements. It was a world of bare sustenance. And then there was the hygiene. Forget daily showers and fresh clothes. Bathing was a rare luxury, perhaps once a month for the very wealthy, and often involved communal tubs. For many knights, especially on campaign, a proper bath might be an annual event. If that, imagine the constant grime, the pervasive body odor, and the persistent itch of fleas and lice, which were common companions for everyone, regardless of status. Their clothes, often wool and leather, were difficult to clean and rarely washed thoroughly. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it contributed significantly to the spread of disease. Speaking of disease, it was a constant, terrifying companion throughout the medieval period. Without any understanding of germ theory, illnesses spread rapidly and indiscriminately. The Black Death, of course, is the most famous example, wiping out huge swaths of the population. But even common ailments like dysentery, smallpox, measles, and influenza were deadly killers. A simple cut could lead to a fatal infection. A persistent fever could be a death sentence. Imagine waking up with a cough or a fever, knowing there was no doctor who could truly cure you, no antibiotics to fight off infection. Your best hope was a strong constitution and prayer. This constant threat of illness, always lurking in the background, added an immense psychological burden to daily life. Medical care was rudimentary at best, and often barbaric. Doctors and barbers who often performed surgeries relied on a mix of herbal remedies, superstitious beliefs, and crude surgical practices like bloodletting or amputation without anesthesia. Wounds, whether from battle or accident, often festered and became infected, leading to agonizing pain and death. Imagine having a broken bone set without pain relief, or a limb amputated with nothing but a swig of ale to numb the pain. The screams from the castle's rudimentary infirmary would be a chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the limitations of medieval medicine. A grisly historical detail. You know, some medieval doctors probably caused more problems than they solved. It's like, have a headache. Let's drill a hole in your skull. They really lived up to the trial and error part of medicine. Even the very castles and living conditions were far from comfortable. While impressive fortifications, they were often damp, cold, and drafty. Heating relied on smoky fireplaces that did little to warm vast stone halls and often filled rooms with irritating fumes. Lighting was provided by flickering torches or candles, casting long, dancing shadows that made the nights truly dark. Sanitation was basic. Privy's latrines might simply empty into a moat or a pit below, contributing to pervasive odors and disease. Imagine trying to sleep in a cold, echoing chamber, with the sounds of the castle settling around you, and the constant awareness of discomfort. The physical toll of knighthood was immense, even outside of battle. The heavy armor, the rigorous training, the constant travel, the harsh living conditions, all contributed to a body that would be constantly aching, bruised, and strained. Knights often suffered from chronic joint pain, back problems, and old wounds that never truly healed. Imagine the nagging pain that would be a constant companion, making every movement a conscious effort, eroding your energy and spirit over time. There were no physical therapists, no painkillers beyond basic herbal remedies. You simply endured. The realities of travel were also brutal. Journeys were slow, arduous, and dangerous. Roads were often little more than muddy tracks, infested with bandits. Knights on campaign would spend weeks or months on the road, living off the land, sleeping in makeshift camps, and constantly exposed to the elements. Imagine the discomfort of riding a horse for hours on end, day after day, in all kinds of weather, with no modern amenities. It highlights how much simpler and harder life was when travel was a true expedition, not just a matter of hopping on a plane. The lack of widespread literacy and access to information meant that most knights despite their noble status, were not highly educated beyond military and courtly matters. Information traveled slowly, often by word of mouth, leading to widespread rumors and misinformation. Imagine relying on a few scribes or traveling minstrels for news of the wider world, or struggling to read complex documents. This limited access to knowledge, while perhaps not a brutality, certainly limited their worldview and often kept them intellectually confined. Historians still debate the true literacy rates among medieval nobility, with some arguing it was higher than commonly assumed, but it was certainly not universal. Finally, consider the psychological stress of constant feuding and political intrigue. Even when not fighting foreign wars, knights were often embroiled in local power struggles, family feuds, and betrayals. Alliances were fragile, and loyalty could shift quickly. Imagine the constant vigilance required, the need to assess threats, and the potential for betrayal from within your own ranks or family. This pervasive tension, this need to constantly guard your power and reputation, would have been an exhausting and deeply isolating experience. Your life, and the lives of those dependent on you, hung on the delicate balance of power and a network of constantly shifting allegiances. As the persistent aches and subtle discomforts of medieval life begin to fade, let your own soft bed and the quiet of your room bring you profound comfort. You've journeyed through the unglamorous realities that underpinned knighthood, the harsh diet, the poor hygiene, the constant shadow of disease, and the pervasive physical and psychological strain. The brutal truth is that even for these figures of legend, life was a daily battle against hardship, a far cry from the romanticized tales. May the ease of your modern existence settle deeply tonight, bringing you restful sleep as the lingering phantom aches of a knight's daily life begin to recede. A more intense sensation replaces them, the heavy, suffocating weight of armor. The air around you feels dense, metallic, and surprisingly hot, even as you imagine the chill of a medieval battlefield. We often picture knights in gleaming, invincible suits of steel, but the brutal truth of medieval armor was far from glamorous. It was a technological marvel of its time. Yes, but also a physical prison, a furnace, and, at times, a deadly trap. Imagine yourself as a knight, preparing for battle around, say, 1450 in the midst of the Wars of the Roses in England. You're not just pulling on a shirt, you're undergoing a complex, hour-long process of being encased in layers of steel. First, padded garments to absorb shock and prevent chafing, then mail shirts, and finally, interlocking plates of polished steel, held together by countless buckles, straps, and rivets. This full-plate armor could weigh anywhere from 50 to 70 pounds, sometimes even more. Imagine trying to simply move in this much weight, let alone fight for your life. It was an enormous physical burden, and the very act of donning it was an exhausting feat. The most immediate brutality of armor was its weight and restrictiveness. Every movement required immense effort. To lift your arms, to turn your head, to swing a sword, and each action was a deliberate, muscle-straining endeavor. Imagine the fatigue that would set in quickly, even before the battle truly began. Running was nearly impossible, and falling over could be catastrophic. While armor was designed to distribute weight, it still felt like carrying a person on your back. Constantly. This physical exertion alone could wear a knight down, making him vulnerable even to a less skilled, but fresher, opponent. Then there was the heat. Plate armor, being essentially a metal shell, trapped body heat with alarming efficiency. In the summer sun, or even during strenuous combat, a knight could quickly overheat to dangerous levels. Imagine sweating profusely inside that metal shell, the sweat stinging your eyes, soaking your padded undergarments, and having nowhere to go. Heat stroke and dehydration were constant threats on the battlefield, silently claiming more lives than enemy blades. A historical fact often overlooked is that many knights fought with their visors open until the very last moment, simply to get enough air and cool down. A risky but necessary gamble. The lack of visibility and hearing inside a helmet was another significant disadvantage. A closed visor, while protecting your face, severely limited your peripheral vision and muffled sounds. Imagine trying to fight in a chaotic battle with hundreds of men around you. Your vision reduced to a narrow slit and shouts sounding distant and indistinct. You couldn't easily see threats approaching from the side or clearly hear commands from your commander. This sensory deprivation added to the confusion and danger, making effective communication and situational awareness incredibly difficult. You know, some medieval knights probably spent half the battle just trying to figure out which way was up, or if that was their lord yelling or just a very enthusiastic bird. Communication breakdowns were epic. Armor, despite its strength, also had surprising vulnerabilities. While excellent against direct cuts and thrusts, it could be defeated by specialized weapons designed to exploit its weaknesses. Hammers, maces, and poleaxes could deliver crushing blows that, even if they didn't penetrate, could cause severe internal injuries, broken bones, concussions, or ruptured organs. Imagine being struck by a heavy, blunt weapon, feeling the impact reverberate through your entire body. Even if the armor remained intact, the force could still kill or incapacitate you. Falling in full armor was a terrifying prospect. If you were unhorsed or tripped, getting back up could be an arduous task, especially in the thick of combat or in muddy terrain. Imagine lying on the ground, struggling to right yourself while enemies swarmed around you, looking for a weak spot, or to deliver a fatal blow. A knight on the ground was a knight at a severe disadvantage, often quickly overwhelmed. This vulnerability when dismounted was a constant source of fear. Maintaining armor was a constant, laborious task. Plate armor rusted easily, especially in damp climates. It required regular cleaning, polishing, and repair. Imagine spending hours meticulously oiling and buffing your suit, ensuring every rivet and strap was in perfect working order. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about ensuring your survival. A weak point, a rusted joint, or a faulty buckle could mean the difference between life and death on the battlefield. This ongoing maintenance burden was a significant, if unglamorous, part of a knight's life. The cost of armor was astronomical. A full suit of plate armor could cost as much as a small farm or a significant amount of land. This made it a symbol of immense wealth and status, but also a crushing financial burden. Knights often inherited their armor, or went heavily into debt to acquire it. Imagine the pressure of protecting such a valuable, life-saving investment, knowing that its damage or loss could bankrupt you and leave you vulnerable. This financial strain was a constant weight, even for the most well-equipped knight. Even the glamour of a tournament hid a brutal truth. While organized combat in the lists was less lethal than open warfare, it was still incredibly dangerous. Jousting, despite its rules, involved two heavily armored men charging at each other on horseback with lances. Broken bones, concussions, and even death were not uncommon. Imagine the roar of the crowd, the thrill of the charge, but also the sharp, searing pain of a lance shattering against your shield, or the impact of being unhorsed. The pursuit of glory came at a significant physical risk, a less-known aspect where historians debate the actual lethality of tournaments versus popular perception. Finally, consider the psychological impact of always being encased in such a cumbersome life-or-death garment. It was a constant reminder of the violence inherent in their profession. It separated them from the world, a protective shell that also acted as a barrier. Imagine living a life where the expectation was that you would regularly put on this heavy, hot, restrictive suit to face mortal danger. This was not just a job, it was a way of life, defined by the weight of steel and the constant threat of injury or death, as the heavy, confining images of medieval armor slowly dissipate, and the gentle quiet of your room settles around you. Feel the incredible freedom of your own body, unencumbered and light. You've journeyed through the hidden, brutal realities of a knight's primary protection, its immense weight, the suffocating heat, the limited senses, and its surprising vulnerabilities. The gleaming armor, in truth, was a testament to both ingenious craftsmanship and relentless physical hardship. May the ease of your own comfortable sleep feel all the more profound tonight, knowing the true burden of a knight's gleaming shell, as the heavy, clanking image of medieval armor recedes, giving way to the subtle discomforts that plagued its wearer. A new, equally pervasive set of challenges begins to manifest. The air around you now seems to carry the faint, sweet scent of decay mixed with the earthy smell of unwashed bodies. You are now settling into the brutal truth of the medieval knight's daily life beyond the battlefield, a constant struggle against invisible foes' disease, discomfort, and the stark realities of a world utterly devoid of modern amenities. Imagine yourself a knight, not in shining armor, but perhaps wrapped in a rough woolen tunic, seated by a flickering fire in a drafty castle. Your teeth might ache, your stomach might rumble uncomfortably, and a persistent itch might plague your skin. This wasn't the life of luxury we sometimes associate with nobility. It was a life of pervasive discomfort. Castles, while impressive fortresses, were rarely comfortable homes. They were cold, damp, and often poorly lit. Heating relied on smoky fireplaces that did little to warm vast stone halls, and often filled rooms with irritating fumes, causing respiratory issues. Imagine the constant chill seeping into your bones, even indoors, making true warmth a rare luxury. The diet of a knight, though often more varied than a peasant's, was far from what we consider healthy today. It was heavy on meat often salted or smoked, bread, and ale or weak wine as water was frequently unsafe. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal and perishable, meaning chronic deficiencies were common. Imagine the impact of such a diet on your body. Tooth decay would be rampant due to lack of hygiene and diet, leading to agonizing pain and lost teeth. Gout, caused by a diet rich in meat and alcohol, was a common ailment among the wealthy. Scurvy, from lack of vitamin C, would weaken your gums and joints. A constant low-level physical unease would be your daily companion. And speaking of hygiene, or rather, the lack thereof, it was a significant source of daily misery. Bathing was a rare event, perhaps a few times a year for some, and often involved communal tubs with water that quickly became murky. Personal cleanliness, as we understand it, simply didn't exist for most people. Imagine the constant grime beneath your fingernails, the pervasive body odor, and the unsettling sensation of fleas and lice, which were common companions for everyone, regardless of social standing. Clothes, often made of heavy wool or linen, were difficult to wash thoroughly and infrequently laundered, contributing to widespread skin irritations and infections. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a breeding ground for invisible terrors. You know, some medieval knights probably smelled worse than their horses after a long ride. It's like chivalry is dead, and so is the air around me. The omnipresent specter of disease was perhaps the most brutal truth of medieval life. Without germ theory, people had no understanding of how illnesses spread. Epidemics like the Black Death, which devastated Europe in the mid-14th century, long after the height of individual knighthood, but the principles applied to general medieval life could wipe out entire populations. But even common ailments we easily treat today, dysentery, smallpox, measles, influenza, and various fevers, were terrifying, often fatal killers. Imagine waking with a splitting headache or a fever, knowing that there was no cure, only prayer and the slim chance that your body might fight it off. Every cut, every wound, every unexplained ache carried the potential for a swift, agonizing death by infection. Medical care was rudimentary and often quite painful. Physicians relied on ancient theories like the four humors, prescribing treatments that often did more harm than good, such as bloodletting or purging. Barbers often doubled as surgeons, performing crude amputations or setting bones without anesthesia, beyond perhaps a strong drink. Imagine the agony of a broken limb being set, or an arrow being extracted, with no modern pain relief. Infections were rampant in open wounds, leading to gangrene and often death. A simple abscessed tooth, easily fixed today, could lead to a life-threatening infection. Your health was a constant, precarious gamble, and the human body was remarkably vulnerable. This is a common historical understanding, but it's hard to truly grasp the daily fear it instilled. The harsh realities of medieval travel contributed significantly to discomfort and disease. Journeys were slow, arduous, and dangerous. Roads were unpaved, often muddy quagmires in wet weather, and infested with bandits. Knights on campaign would spend weeks or months sleeping in makeshift camps, exposed to the elements, drinking questionable water, and constantly living in close proximity to unwashed soldiers and animals. Imagine the exhaustion, the constant dampness, the endless miles of rough terrain, and the stomach ailments that would inevitably arise from poor sanitation and contaminated food. The romantic image of a knight riding heroically across the land quickly evaporates when you consider the sheer, gritty discomfort of actual medieval travel. The lack of effective waste management in castles and towns meant a constant battle against filth. Privy's latrines often emptied into moats or simply into pits below the castle walls, creating pervasive foul odors and attracting disease-carrying vermin. Animals, from livestock to stray dogs, roamed freely, adding to the general unsanitary conditions. Imagine living in a constant haze of unpleasant smells, knowing that the very air you breathed carried the potential for illness. This environmental reality was a daily, unavoidable assault on the senses. Beyond the physical, there was the psychological toll of superstition and limited knowledge. In a world without scientific understanding of disease, illness was often attributed to divine punishment, evil spirits, or astrological alignments. This led to a profound sense of helplessness and fear. Imagine trying to explain or cope with widespread death when your only framework is a belief in an angry god or malevolent forces. It fostered a mindset where fate was often seen as immutable, and individual agency against such overwhelming forces seemed futile. This intellectual confinement, based on belief rather than empirical understanding, was a subtle but profound hardship. Even the simple act of sleeping was rarely peaceful. Castles were noisy places, full of servants, guards, and animals. Drafts would whistle through cracks in the stone, and the ever-present threat of attack, even if distant, meant a knight had to sleep lightly, always prepared to rise at a moment's notice. Imagine trying to find deep, restorative sleep amidst the constant cold, the unfamiliar sounds, and the underlying anxiety of a precarious world. The concept of a quiet, dark, temperature-controlled bedroom was centuries away. Finally, consider the cumulative effect of these daily brutalities. It wasn't just one illness or one discomfort, but a constant barrage of them. A knight's life was a continuous grind against physical pain, environmental hardship, and the omnipresent threat of disease. Their renowned toughness was not just a product of training, it was a necessity forged by simply enduring these relentless, often invisible battles every single day. The glamorous tales rarely tell of the knight battling chronic dysentery or raging fever after a hard day's ride. Yet, these were the true, unglamorous realities, as the persistent aches, the phantom itches, and the subtle discomforts of medieval life slowly fade into the soft, comforting quiet of your own bed. Allow yourself to feel the warmth of your covers, the ease of your breath. You've journeyed through the unseen, brutal truths of a knight's existence, the harsh diet, the pervasive unhygiene, the constant shadow of deadly disease, and the relentless physical and psychological strain. The romantic ideal of chivalry often glosses over a reality that was far more gritty, painful, and precarious. May the remarkable comfort and health of your modern life settle deeply tonight, bringing you truly restful sleep, far from the subtle torments of the past. As the lingering phantom pains of medieval disease and discomfort begin to recede, a more insidious, yet equally brutal, truth emerges from the shadows of history. The clang of armor and the cries of battle fade, replaced by the hushed whispers of court intrigue, the clink of coin, and the chilling silence of promises broken. You are now entering the realm where the ideals of chivalry met the harsh realities of medieval power. The age when the code was often conveniently breached, ignored, or outright manipulated for personal gain. This wasn't about honor, it was about survival, land, and influence. Imagine yourself a knight, perhaps in the court of a powerful lord, in, say, England during the volatile reign of King Stephen, or in France during the Hundred Years' War. You are surrounded by men who outwardly profess adherence to chivalry, courage, loyalty, justice, yet beneath the veneer, a ruthless game of power and self-interest is constantly being played. The code of chivalry, in practice, was often a flexible instrument, bent to suit the needs of the powerful, rather than a rigid moral compass. A common misconception is that chivalry was a static, universally followed code. In reality, it was fluid and often selectively applied. One of the most brutal truths was the frequent betrayal of oaths. Feudal society was built on a complex web of loyalty oaths between lords and vassals. A knight swore fealty to his lord, promising service and allegiance. Yet these oaths were frequently broken, often for better land, more wealth, or simply to back a winning side in a conflict. Imagine swearing your life to one lord, only to find yourself forced to switch allegiances a year later, fighting against former comrades. The concept of treason was ever present, and the consequences of being on the wrong side of a betrayal could be swift and fatal. This constant shifting of loyalties made life precarious and trust a rare commodity. The concept of justice within chivalry was also highly selective. While the code spoke of protecting the innocent and upholding justice, this often applied only to other nobles or fellow knights. For commoners, justice was far more arbitrary, often meted out by the whims of the local lord. There were no impartial courts for the peasantry, no due process. Imagine a knight who would chivalrously duel another noble for an insult, yet brutally punish a peasant for poaching a rabbit from his land. The justice of the era was deeply stratified, reflecting the rigid social hierarchy rather than universal fairness. Consider the treatment of non-combatants during war. While chivalry ideally called for mercy towards women, children, and unarmed clerics, the reality, as we touched upon, was often far different. Raids, sieges, and the sacking of towns frequently involved widespread atrocities, pillage, rape, and indiscriminate slaughter. Imagine witnessing such horrors or hearing of them, knowing that the very men who claimed to be honorable knights were capable of such acts. This glaring contradiction between the ideal and the practice highlights the often thin veneer of morality that coded the brutal realities of medieval warfare. A common historical debate revolves around whether the brutal realities of medieval warfare proved the failure of chivalry, or if chivalry was merely an aspirational ideal rarely achieved. The pursuit of wealth and land often trumped any notion of chivalric purity. Knights needed land and resources to maintain their status, equipment, and retinue. This drove constant skirmishes, land grabs, and attempts to expand their domains, often at the expense of weaker neighbors or even family members. Imagine a knight who outwardly championed Christian values and honor, yet ruthlessly seized the lands of a distant relative or exploited his serfs for greater gain. The economic realities of maintaining a knightly lifestyle often necessitated actions that were far from honorable. Driving a wedge between the ideal and the practical, even tournaments and jousts, and while ostensibly displays of chivalry and martial skill, were often driven by ambition and personal gain. Winning a tournament brought not just glory, but valuable prizes, ransoms from defeated opponents, and the favor of powerful lords and ladies. They could be venues for settling personal scores, for displaying wealth, and for furthering political ambitions, rather than purely noble contests. Imagine the intense pressure to win, knowing that your reputation, your future, and perhaps even your finances depended on your performance in what was essentially a highly dangerous, glorified sporting event. You know, some historians argue that medieval tournaments were basically the UFC of their day, just with more chainmail and fancier hats. All that chivalry was just for the cameras, or rather, the courtly poets. The ransoming of noble prisoners was another aspect where economics often superseded pure chivalry. Captured knights and lords were rarely executed. Instead, they were held for ransom, often for immense sums that could impoverish their families for generations. This system, while preventing widespread slaughter of the nobility, also created a perverse incentive for capture rather than outright killing. Imagine being a wealthy knight, captured in battle, knowing that your freedom meant financially ruining your family for years to come. For those of lesser status, a ransom was impossible, and capture usually meant death or brutal servitude. Feuds and personal vengeance often overrode any adherence to a higher code. Despite notions of justice and peace, personal insults, land disputes, or perceived slights could ignite bloody feuds that lasted for generations, involving entire families and their retainers. Imagine living in a world where personal honor demanded violent retribution, and where the rule of law was often secondary to the cycle of vengeance. These localized conflicts, often fueled by personal pride and vendetta, contributed significantly to the pervasive violence of the era. Even among the knightly class, the role of the church in enforcing chivalry was also complex. While the church promoted ideals of peace and protection of the vulnerable through initiatives like the Truce of God, its influence was often limited by the secular power of the nobility. Knights might engage in crusades, fighting for Christian ideals, yet ruthlessly pillage and destroy within their own lands. The church condemned certain acts of violence but often lacked the power to truly enforce its moral authority universally, highlighting the constant tension between spiritual ideals and worldly power. Finally, consider the hypocrisy inherent in the system. Knights were expected to be pious, yet they engaged in rampant violence. They were supposed to protect the weak, yet they often exploited the peasantry. They swore loyalty, yet frequently betrayed oaths. This constant dissonance between the idealized code and the brutal reality created a society that, for all its grand pronouncements, was often deeply cynical and pragmatic. The chivalry we remember was often a carefully curated performance, a set of manners and expectations for certain social interactions, rather than a universal moral guideline for all behavior. This fundamental contradiction is a crucial point for understanding the era, as the sounds of courtly intrigue and the clink of hidden agendas slowly fade. Allow the quiet of your room to settle around you. You've journeyed through the uncomfortable truths of chivalry, witnessing how its noble ideals were so often bent, broken, or utterly ignored in the relentless pursuit of power, wealth, and survival. The Age of Knights, for all its romantic allure, was a brutal, pragmatic, and often hypocritical world. May the honest quietude of your own sleep bring you peace, far from the complex deceptions of a bygone age. As the whispers of courtly intrigue and the echoes of broken oaths fade, a new, more visceral reality permeates your awareness. The air grows thick with the smell of horse sweat, nervous anticipation, and the faint metallic tang of blood. You are now truly within the brutal heart of medieval warfare, not in the romanticized joust, but in the chaotic, terrifying melee of a full-scale battlefield. This chapter strips away any remaining illusions about the glory of combat, revealing its raw, devastating truth. Imagine yourself as a knight, not in a controlled tournament, but at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, or perhaps Hastings in 1066, caught in the thick of a real engagement. The first sound you'd truly register wouldn't be a trumpet's noble call, but the terrifying roar of thousands of men, shouts, curses, war cries, all blending into a deafening wall of sound designed to intimidate and disorient. Then, the rhythmic thudding of charging horses, the creak of stretching longbows, and finally the sickening thud of arrows raining down. These weren't precision strikes, they were volleys designed to darken the sky and sow chaos, often hitting friend and foe alike. Once the lines met, the battlefield transformed into a nightmarish scrum. This was hand-to-hand combat in its most brutal form. You'd be fighting in extremely close quarters, surrounded by a churning mass of bodies, steel, and mud. Imagine the clang of swords on shields, the heavy thud of axes striking armor, the sickening crunch of bone. The ground would quickly become slick with blood, making footing precarious. There was no clean fighting. It was a desperate, exhausting struggle to kill or be killed. Every swing, every thrust, was a desperate attempt for survival. The weapons of the medieval era were designed for maximum damage against armored and unarmored bodies alike. Swords could hack off limbs. Lances, though often used for the initial charge, became devastating spears in the melee. Maces and warhammers, designed to bypass plate armor by crushing what was beneath, inflicted horrific internal injuries. Axes could split shields and cleave through helmets. Imagine the sheer destructive power, the brutal efficiency of these tools designed solely for killing. The wounds they inflicted were gruesome. Gaping gashes, shattered bones, dismemberments, and then the wounds themselves. Without modern understanding of infection or pain management, even a relatively minor wound could quickly turn fatal. A cut, if deep enough, would bleed profusely, leading to shock and collapse. A broken bone, if not set correctly and often without anesthetic, could lead to lifelong disability or gangrene. Imagine trying to fight through the searing pain of a serious injury, your adrenaline masking the severity until it was too late. The cries of the wounded, lying helpless on the battlefield after the main fighting passed, would be a chilling testament to the agony of the era. A common, grim historical fact. You know, many medieval soldiers probably spent more time dying slowly from infected wounds than they did actually fighting. Turns out, heroic death usually involved a lot of fever and pus. The sheer physical exhaustion of battle was immense. Fighting in heavy armor, swinging cumbersome weapons, and constantly pushing against the massive bodies would quickly drain your strength. Imagine your muscles screaming, your lungs burning, your vision blurring from fatigue and exertion. Many fell not from direct blows, but from sheer exhaustion, making them easy targets for an enemy's final strike. This wasn't a sprint, it was a brutal marathon of violence. The psychological toll was immense and immediate. The fear, the adrenaline, the utter chaos, the constant proximity to death, all combined to create a profound trauma. Imagine witnessing your comrades fall, seeing horrific injuries, and constantly facing your own mortality. There was no debriefing, no therapy, no support for the shell shock, as it would later be called, that would inevitably follow. Knights were simply expected to endure, to compartmentalize the horrors, and to be ready to fight again. This unspoken suffering, this mental scars of the battlefield, is often ignored in romanticized portrayals. Treatment of the fallen was far from glorious. After a battle, the field would be a gruesome tableau of dead and dying. The victorious side might search for valuable armor or loot the bodies. Wounded common soldiers were often left to die, or, if lucky, perhaps captured for ransom, though this was mostly for nobility. There were no organized stretcher bearers or field hospitals. Imagine lying wounded on a cold, muddy field, listening to the sounds of the living pillaging the dead, knowing your own end was near, perhaps from exposure or the attention of scavengers. The fragility of command and control in the chaos of battle often led to mass casualties. Communications were rudimentary, relying on shouts, trumpets, and banners that could easily be lost in the din. Commanders often had little real-time information and could only react to what they could see directly. Imagine being a knight, completely immersed in a localized melee, unable to tell if your side was winning or losing overall, or if a tactical retreat had been ordered. This lack of information often led to units fighting on long after the main battle was lost, suffering needless casualties. This complex dynamic of battlefield control is still a subject of academic debate among military historians. Finally, consider the unpredictability of death. It wasn't always the grand, heroic blow. A stray arrow could find its mark. A hidden pit could trap a horse. A slippery patch of mud could cause a fall, leading to a quick, brutal end. Death on the medieval battlefield was often sudden, indiscriminate, and utterly devoid of the glory often ascribed to it. It was a chaotic lottery, where skill and strength were important, but luck often played the decisive role. This random, arbitrary nature of battlefield demise is a far cry from controlled narratives. You know, dying heroically in battle probably involved less dramatic last words and more accidentally slipping on a dead guy and getting an axe to the face. Just saying. As the terrifying roar of the medieval battlefield fades into the comforting quiet of your room, let the sounds of peace envelop you. You've journeyed through the raw, devastating truth of combat, stripped of its romantic veneer, the brutal chaos, the gruesome wounds, the physical and psychological torment. The chivalric ideal often crashed against the bloody reality of medieval warfare, revealing a world where survival was a desperate, unglamorous struggle. May the profound safety and stillness of your night bring you deep, restorative sleep, far from the echoes of that brutal past, as the terrifying clamor of the medieval battlefield finally recedes and the ringing in your imaginary ears subsides. A different kind of pressure begins to assert itself. It's not the physical weight of armor or the immediate threat of a sword, but the constant insidious strain of feudal politics and internal conflict. The air around you feels thick with suspicion, whispered plots, and the uneasy truce that often lay beneath the surface of medieval power structures. This chapter delves into the less glorious, more brutal truth of a knight's life, the constant threat from within their own society. Imagine yourself a knight, living in a fortified manor in, say, the Holy Roman Empire around the 13th century. Your biggest threat wasn't always a foreign invader. More often, it was your neighbor, your liege lord, or even a rival within your own family. Feudalism, with its fragmented power and complex web of allegiances, was a breeding ground for constant, localized warfare and feuds. These weren't grand, decisive battles, but continuous skirmishes, raids and acts of aggression that kept regions in a perpetual state of instability. The concept of loyalty was paramount, yet constantly tested and often betrayed. A knight swore fealty to his lord, promising military service and counsel. But if a more powerful lord offered better lands, or if your current lord suffered a military defeat, switching allegiances was a common, albeit risky, move. Imagine the moral tightrope you'd walk, balancing your oath with your own survival and ambition. Being perceived as disloyal, even without outright betrayal, could lead to devastating consequences. Loss of land, imprisonment, or even death. This constant negotiation of loyalty was a brutal psychological burden. Political intrigue and treachery were as much a part of courtly life as grand feasts and tournaments. Noble families constantly vied for power, land, and influence. This often involved complex marriage alliances, but just as frequently, it involved plots, assassinations, and strategic betrayals. Imagine being a knight caught up in such a web, unsure whom to trust, knowing that a misstep in court could be as deadly as a sword blow on the battlefield. Poison, ambush, and false accusations were not uncommon tools in this relentless pursuit of power. This cutthroat political environment is a far cry from modern, organized politics. The lack of a strong central government in many medieval regions meant that law enforcement was often localized and inconsistent. Disputes between powerful lords could easily escalate into private wars, with little oversight from a distant king or emperor. Imagine trying to live peacefully when your powerful neighbors might decide to settle a land dispute with armed retainers and fire, burning your fields and raiding your villages in the process. The peace was often a fragile truce, easily shattered by a perceived insult or a minor grievance. Succession crises were particularly brutal. When a lord died, especially without a clear heir, or if the heir was a child, a power vacuum could open, leading to bitter, often violent, struggles among relatives and rivals. Imagine the chaos that would ensue, as various factions, each with their own armed knights, descended upon the lands, claiming titles and seizing property. These internal conflicts could be just as devastating, if not more so than external wars, tearing families and regions apart from within. Even judicial processes were often tied to personal power. While some formal courts existed, the authority of a lord over his vassals and peasants was immense. Justice could be arbitrary, influenced by personal relationships, wealth, or the simple desire to assert authority. Imagine being a peasant, having a dispute with a local noble, knowing that your chances of a fair hearing were slim, and that the lord's decision was absolute, with little possibility of appeal. This lack of impartial justice meant that the powerful often operated with impunity, while the weak had little recourse. You know, due process in the Middle Ages usually involved a lord saying, "because I said so," and then maybe hitting you with something. Very efficient, if not entirely fair. The burden of housing and feeding armed retainers was also a constant strain. A knight needed a retinue of squires, men-at-arms, and servants to maintain his status and fight his battles. Providing for these men, especially during times of peace, was a significant financial drain. Imagine the challenge of keeping so many mouths fed, so many bodies clothed, and so many horses stabled, even when no active campaign was underway. This economic pressure often drove knights to participate in raids or seek patronage from more powerful lords, further perpetuating the cycle of conflict and dependence. The lack of widespread literacy also contributed to the brutality of internal politics. Treaties, agreements, and even laws were often communicated orally or by a few trusted scribes. This made them susceptible to misinterpretation, deliberate deception, or simply being forgotten. Imagine entering into a complex agreement, relying solely on memory or the word of another, knowing that a crucial detail could be twisted or denied later. This intellectual vulnerability could be exploited by unscrupulous individuals, leading to disputes and further conflict. Historians continue to debate how much of medieval political maneuvering was due to genuine illiteracy versus deliberate ambiguity in written documents for later strategic advantage. Finally, consider the psychological impact of constant suspicion and low-level violence. Living in a world where your neighbor might become your enemy overnight, where your lord might demand service that puts you in peril for his personal gain, and where betrayal could lurk around every corner, would have fostered a pervasive sense of distrust. Imagine being constantly on guard, weighing every word, every gesture, for hidden meanings or potential threats. This constant vigilance, this inability to truly relax, would have been a profound and enduring source of stress for knights and nobles alike, shaping their worldview and their relationships. The gilded cages of medieval power were often just as brutal as any dungeon, as the uneasy silence of medieval court intrigue and the distant sounds of petty conflict fade. Allow the quiet comfort of your own bed to settle deeply around you. You've journeyed through the unseen, brutal truths of knighthood's inner world, the relentless feuds, the shifting loyalties, the selective justice, and the constant threat of betrayal from within their own ranks. The romantic tales of chivalry rarely speak of the cynicism and pragmatism that often governed these internal power struggles. May the peace of your knight bring you a deep sense of security and trust, far from the turbulent politics of a bygone age. As the complex web of medieval political intrigue and the echoes of internal feuds fade from your mind, a different, yet equally oppressive, burden begins to materialize. It's not the clang of swords or the rustle of courtly silks, but the relentless whisper of anxiety about money, about land, about maintaining a costly image. You are now settling into the brutal truth of the economic realities of knighthood, the immense financial burden and precarious existence that often underpin the glittering facade of chivalry. Imagine yourself a knight, perhaps a young one, aspiring to glory, or an older one struggling to maintain your ancestral lands in, say, Gascony or the Scottish borders. The very first brutal truth you'd confront is the astronomical cost of maintaining a knightly lifestyle. This wasn't a cheap profession. Your armor, your war horses, your weapons, your retinue of squires and men-at-arms, your castle or manor house, all required vast sums of money to acquire and maintain. Imagine the constant financial drain, the worry about how to pay for your next suit of plate armor, which could cost as much as a small farm. War horses alone were an enormous expense. These weren't ordinary farm animals, they were specially bred. Powerful beasts trained for combat, capable of carrying a heavily armored knight into battle. Acquiring and training such a horse cost a fortune, and replacing one lost in battle was a significant blow. Imagine the anxiety of riding into combat, knowing that a single arrow or a misplaced step could mean the loss of one of your most valuable assets, impacting your ability to fight and maintain your status. This reliance on incredibly expensive animals was a constant economic vulnerability. Then there was the cost of equipment and weaponry. While armor was the largest single expense, swords, lances, shields, and other armaments needed to be forged, maintained, and replaced. Imagine the endless cycle of repairs, the constant need for mastersmiths to keep your gear in fighting condition. This wasn't a one-time purchase, it was a perpetual investment in your very survival and professional capability. A knight without proper arms and armor was a knight without a purpose. Vulnerable and stripped of status, maintaining a retinue was essential for a knight's prestige and military effectiveness. You couldn't simply show up to battle alone. You needed squires to assist you, men-at-arms to fight alongside you, and various servants to manage your household. Providing food, lodging, and wages or provisions in lieu of wages for these individuals was a continuous financial drain. Imagine the challenge of feeding dozens of people every day, all year round, often from the resources of your own lands. This was a significant part of a knight's economic burden, often leading to debt. The primary source of income for most knights was land. Their wealth came from the rents, labor, or produce extracted from the peasants who worked their estates. But this income was highly volatile. A bad harvest, a period of drought, or the devastation of war could drastically reduce your agricultural output, leading to severe financial hardship. Imagine the profound anxiety of watching your crops fail due to bad weather, knowing that your family's well-being and your ability to maintain your knightly lifestyle depended entirely on the whims of nature. There was no concept of crop insurance or diversified investments. Pillage and plunder during wartime, while lucrative for some, were also highly unpredictable and morally dubious sources of income. While a successful campaign might bring spoils, it was a risky venture, and losses could easily outweigh gains. Relying on plunder for your income meant participating in brutal acts against non-combatants, further blurring the lines between chivalry and simple greed. Imagine the pressure to participate in a raid, even if it meant burning villages and terrorizing peasants. Simply to keep your finances afloat, ransom was a significant economic factor for captured knights. If you were unlucky enough to be captured in battle, you could expect to be held for a ransom that often impoverished your family for generations. This system, while preventing outright slaughter, put an immense financial strain on noble families. Imagine your family liquidating assets, selling lands, and borrowing heavily just to secure your freedom. For many, emerging from captivity meant a lifetime of debt and diminished status. This economic aspect of capture is a less discussed but incredibly important part of a knight's reality. The feudal system itself, with its layers of obligations, could be financially draining. As a vassal, you might owe your lord military service, but also financial payments at certain times, or hospitality when he traveled through your lands. These obligations, while part of the system, could be significant burdens, especially if your own resources were already stretched thin. Imagine trying to balance your income with these expected payments and services, constantly feeling the pressure from above. The lack of a stable and widespread banking system meant that borrowing money was difficult and often came with extremely high interest rates. If a knight needed a loan for armor, horses, or to pay a ransom, he often had to turn to wealthy merchants or Jewish moneylenders at rates that could quickly trap him in a spiral of debt. Imagine the shame and desperation of having to mortgage your lands or pledge your future income, knowing that failure to repay could lead to ruin. This financial vulnerability was a constant, gnawing anxiety. A popular academic debate point, historians still argue about whether the church's prohibition on usury lending money at interest actually helped medieval knights by pushing them to more ethical forms of finance, or just forced them into the hands of less scrupulous lenders. Probably the latter, let's be honest. Finally, consider the pressure to maintain appearances. A knight, even a financially struggling one, was expected to live up to a certain standard of pomp and circumstance. He needed to host banquets, wear fine clothes under his armor, and display generosity to his retainers. This constant need to project an image of wealth and power, even when on the brink of destitution, added another layer of psychological and financial stress. The ideal of chivalry often demanded a lifestyle that was simply unsustainable for many, forcing them into desperate measures or quiet ruin, as the clinking of imaginary coin and the rustle of debt scrolls fade, and the quiet comfort of your own bed surrounds you. Allow yourself to feel the ease of your own financial security, however modest. You've journeyed through the immense and often crushing economic realities that underpinned knighthood, the astronomical costs of gear and horses, the constant threat of ruin from bad harvests or ransoms, and the unending struggle to maintain a costly image. The brutal truth is that chivalry, for all its glory, often came with a crushing price tag, driving many knights into a life of constant financial anxiety. May the peace of your knight bring you a deep sense of contentment, far from the monetary burdens of a bygone age, as the subtle anxieties of medieval finance and the echoes of a knight's costly existence finally dissipate. A profound stillness settles around you. We have journeyed through the shining, romanticized image of knighthood, only to pull back the curtain and reveal the brutal truths beneath. Now, as our exploration draws to a close, let's allow these varied realities to coalesce into a deeper, more peaceful reflection on the complex and often contradictory legacy of knighthood and chivalry. Consider first the enduring power of the myth versus the reality. For centuries, the image of the noble knight, brave and virtuous, has captured imaginations. We've seen him in gleaming armor, upholding justice and protecting the weak. Yet, our journey has revealed a far grittier truth, a life of brutal training, savage warfare, pervasive disease, constant discomfort, and often cynical political maneuvering. The brutal truth isn't meant to diminish the era, but rather to highlight the immense gap between the ideal and the lived experience. Imagine how much stronger the myth had to be to overcome such harsh realities. Reflect on the inherent contradictions of the chivalric code. It spoke of honor, yet sanctioned brutal raids. It demanded loyalty, yet was often betrayed for personal gain. It protected noble women, yet offered little to no protection for peasant women. This was not a universal moral framework, but a set of expectations largely applied within a specific social class, and often conveniently ignored when inconvenient. Imagine the mental gymnastics required to reconcile these conflicting values, to live a life that simultaneously aspired to high ideals and engaged in profound brutality. This complex ethical landscape is one of the most intriguing aspects of medieval studies, where historians still actively debate the true meaning and impact of chivalry. Think about the constant negotiation of survival. For knights, life was a continuous struggle. They battled external enemies. Yes, but also hunger, disease, political rivals, and financial ruin. Every decision, every action, carried significant stakes. Imagine living with that pervasive sense of precarity, knowing that your life, your lands, and your family's future hung on a delicate balance of power, skill, and sheer luck. This wasn't a world of leisurely comfort. It was a world where even the powerful constantly fought for their existence. Consider the physical and psychological toll that this life exacted. The constant exposure to violence, the recurring injuries, the primitive medical care, the pervasive discomfort, and the heavy burden of armor all combined to create a physically punishing existence. And beyond that, the mental strain of constant vigilance, the fear of betrayal, the trauma of battle, and the responsibility for vast numbers of people. Imagine the exhaustion that must have settled deep into their bones, the invisible scars that lingered long after any physical wounds healed. This profound, cumulative suffering is often erased from the romantic narratives. Reflect on the role of violence as a fundamental social force. For knights, violence wasn't just a last resort, it was a profession, a means of acquiring and maintaining power, and an integral part of their identity. Their lives were shaped by the sword, by the expectation that they would regularly engage in acts of systematic brutality. This embedded nature of violence, both within and between communities, highlights how profoundly different their world was from our own, where violence is ideally contained and condemned. This historical reality provides a sobering contrast to modern efforts to minimize conflict. Think, too, about the human capacity for adaptation and endurance. Despite the pervasive brutality and hardship, medieval knights, and indeed medieval society as a whole, not only survived but built complex social structures, developed sophisticated technologies like plate armor itself, and created enduring cultural artifacts. This ability to adapt to incredibly challenging circumstances, to forge lives and even moments of beauty amidst constant struggle, is a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Finally, let your mind drift to the fading echoes of glory. The age of the knight eventually gave way to new military technologies, changing political structures and evolving social norms. The iconic figure slowly receded, leaving behind a powerful, yet incomplete, legacy. The brutal truths we've explored tonight don't erase the genuine courage or occasional nobility of individual knights, but they paint a more complete, nuanced picture. They remind us that history is rarely simple, and that even the most cherished legends often hide complex, uncomfortable realities. Now, as the stories of medieval knighthood truly fade, and the quiet of your room settles around you like a soft blanket, take a deep, slow breath. Feel the weight of your head on the pillow, the comfort of your covers. The world of clanging steel and muddy battlefields, of brutal truths and complex codes, is now far behind us. Let the gentle sounds of your own peaceful night, perhaps a distant sigh of wind, the soft hum of your fan, guide you deeper into relaxation. There is no urgency, no demand, just the quiet rhythm of your own breath. Rest easy. The night is long, and peace is yours.